Good afternoon, everyone. We hope you're enjoying the conference so far and trust you've had a lot of takeaways from the sessions that you've been participating in. We want to thank you again for joining us for this afternoon's plenary session. Again, my name is Elizabeth Manuel, and I'm the Senior Director of Student Services for our higher education agencies. Before we get started, should you have any questions throughout this presentation, please feel free to place those in the chat box. And of course, at the end of the speaker's presentation, we will address any questions that do come in. So it's my honor to introduce our afternoon plenary session titled, First Gen is Not My Own Identity, Recognizing Intersections. Our plenary speaker is a learner, educator, facilitator, and author. Proud of her rural hometown in Louisiana, her working class Cajun roots, and her first generation college student to PhD journey, she holds a BS in secondary education from LSU, a MS in higher education and student affairs from Florida State, and a PhD in educational research and policy analysis from North Carolina State. Her research interests include social class identity in higher education, college access and success, particular for first-generation college students and students from rural areas, student and women's leadership development and practice, and career preparation and pathways in higher education and student affairs. She has co-authored 4 books, 1 monograph issue, and numerous book chapters and journal articles, and she has served as a speaker and consultant across the United States. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Sonja Ardwin.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Thank you, everybody, for being here with us this afternoon and for sort of engaging in the Student Success Summit throughout the past day or two. We are glad to have you engaging in these topical areas and thinking about how this may impact the work you're doing in education in West Virginia. As Elizabeth mentioned, my name is Sonja. I use she, her pronouns, and I care about these topics because I lived a lot of them. And so, I am a first generation college graduate times 3. I am from a rural area. So to give you some scope about what that looks like, it is for me, I come from a town that doesn't have a zip code. I went to public high school, it's a K-12 school, and I graduated with 23 people. I come from a working class community and a working class family. And so that has sort of been my experience as a student, but also as a administrator and now a faculty member in higher education spaces. I'm also excited to virtually be with you in West Virginia as well. I have spent some time doing some work with some institutions in the state as well as some other organizations within the state. And so really sort of relate to some of the experiences of the students in West Virginia and applaud the work that all of you are doing to sort of bolster education and educational access in the state of West Virginia. So thank you for being with us this afternoon. I wanted to start off with having us think about defining first-generation college student. And some of your other sessions throughout the summit may have addressed some of this as well. But I think when we use the term first-generation college student, we think we're talking all about the same population, and that may or may not be true. And so Dr. Sarah Whitley, who is at the Center for First-Generation Student Success in DC, and some colleagues have done some landscape analyses at both 2-year institutions and 4-year institutions, looking at how our campuses defining first-generation college student. So this is a direct graph from the landscape analysis, and you'll see here that this was the 4-year landscape analysis. You can access all of those for free online, but shows that the definitions are different. And so you'll see here, right, the most popular definition may be the one that you use or your institution uses or you're using at your high schools to sort of frame this conversation, but that neither caregiver of the student has earned a 4-year college degree. So that is the most common definition. It aligns with some of the federal definitions. The federal definitions don't always match either. But you'll see there are some nuances to some of these definitions. So the first one on the screen here you'll see is neither biological parent, which can be interesting to use as a caveat in a definition, because what does that mean for students who are formerly in the foster care system? What does that mean for students who are sort of estranged from their parents or caregivers? You'll see in the third definition, there is some nuance there around location. And so earning a 4-year degree in the United States. We know that not all institutions, or in general, as a country in the United States, do we recognize degrees from other institutions or other countries. And so capturing the international student experience in this first-gen college definition, that third one, whereas maybe some of the other ones would not, and then therefore would not serve some of those international students. So we don't always agree on a definition. There is not one uniform definition that is used at the federal level. There is not one formal definition generally that is used state by state. And then even within a state system of higher education, there can be multiple definitions based on different institutions. So if you are working with high school students that are trying to pursue a 2 or 4 year institution, or you're working in a 4 year or 2 year institution, making sure you know sort of what the definitions are that you're working with, because it really can change the amount of students we're paying attention to and serving in this population. And I'll give you an example of that. So Robert Takushin and some of his colleagues at the University of Georgia did a study a couple years ago using the same sample of students in this study, and applied 8 varying definitions of first-gen college student to that population or sample in their study. And depending on which definition was used, the students who were identified as first-gen ranged really broadly, either between 22% of the sample was identified as first-gen, all the way to 76% based on the definition. So that's pretty much a 55% margin of error, meaning that depending on the definition you use will sort of result in different students being identified as first-gen or not. So understanding the campus definition, if you're on a college campus, is important. And if you are a high school counselor working with students in terms of college access, sort of knowing that different definitions exist and helping students figure out which one the prospective campus uses, so that they may be able to access sort of support structures if they're first-generation college students. So not clear definitions here, but knowing the definitions that are sort of in your area can be really important. If you're wondering where first-generation college students are, this is a map from the United States. The USDA Economic Research Service is pulling from the census data. And this is a slightly older map because they haven't done the new maps with the new census data, but you can see here on the map, anything that is in blue, whether it's dark blue or light blue, are considered low education counties. And what that means is that 20% or more of the residents in that county do not have a high school diploma or its equivalent, so a GED, which means that it is more likely that students in those areas are going to be first-generation college students. That doesn't mean, for example, there are no first-gen students in the Northeast or in the Great Plains, but it is more sort of prevalent in sort of California, the Rio Grande Valley of Texas, and then the Mississippi Valley, and then certain parts you'll see there are some counties here in West Virginia, as well as sort of where West Virginia also borders sort of eastern Kentucky. And so knowing that there is a likelihood there are probably more first-generation college students in those areas based on some of these educational statistics. So just something to consider there in terms of where students are coming from. And then how many are there? So at the bachelor's degree level, there's some National Center for Ed Statistics data that is showing us that about 36% of undergraduate students are at the sort of 4 year level are first generation college students. I like to think of that as sort of a basement or a floor, because again, it's going to depend on the definitions, right? So if you use a different definition, it might be a larger percentage. If you are not including sort of international students in that number, all of those sorts of things. And you can see that sort of stays similar at the master's and doctoral level as well. So knowing that at least a third of students, and it's going to depend on the campus. So 2 year institutions generally have more first generation college students. Regional publics generally have more first generation college students. If you're working in a high school, you may know that it will be more of your students who would identify that way or be identified that way by the institution that they're attending. So thinking about that, but also thinking about, can you, if you're on a college campus, can you obtain your campus level data if your campus is collecting this type of data to figure out the percentage of first generation college students on your campus, because that can also help you advocate for resources for those populations and to develop support structures or specific offices to serve first generation college students, which we're starting to see a little bit of an uptick of in higher education. So now that we sort of have talked about definitions and maybe where some of these students are coming from and how many of them there are sort of more broadly in the United States, also wanting us to think about that there are some common barriers that students face as first-generation college students trying to enter a 2 or 4 year institution. And the reason I chose this image is because I think that's how a lot of first-generation college students feel as they are approaching sort of this higher education possibility for themselves. It feels like a big maze, and you can get caught up in different parts of the maze. There are so many systems. So if we take the image on the screen and really think about each of the little curly, I'm going to call it a curly Q. I don't know the proper name for it, but the little curly Q pieces is one of them might be the financial aid system. One of them might be the admission system. One of them might be the standardized testing system. One of them might be understanding what's possible based on sort of their academic record. One of them might be figuring out the housing and dining plans on the campus. One of them might be figuring out academic advising. And so students can sort of get caught up in all of these systems and feel like they're stuck, and then just say, well, it's too challenging, or it wasn't made for me as a first generation college student. And so I often like to help us think about, where are these ways that students are getting stuck in our maze of systems, and how can we make our systems more smoother pathways for students to be able to access higher education in the ways that are beneficial to them. So if you're a high school counselor thinking about how can I provide information that makes it a smoother process for students to understand admission systems or financial aid processes. If you're on the 2 or 4 year institution side of colleges and universities, how can we make systems simpler for students, families, and caregivers? What does that mean and look like? So lots of sort of challenges here in terms of the fact that we have some bureaucratic and challenging processes, and how do we undo some of that so that first generation college students feel like they can navigate those processes successfully, and that they are sort of not at a disadvantage based on the fact that it's new to them and it might not be new to some of their peers. I want to share a quote with you. This is from the 4-year landscape analysis that was done by the Center for First Gen Student Success. And Molly talks about realizing realizing that she was a first generation college student, and specifically talking about move-in day. And so she says, and everybody during move-in day was with their parents, and all of my suite mates, people she was living with, had carloads of stuff, and I had a suitcase. I realized I was 1,100 miles away from home and alone. And while students may not be going 1,100 miles, they can still have this similar feeling of everybody else sort of knows the secrets of the system, or the hidden curriculum is what we would call it in the literature, and I don't. And so that sort of realization can have an impact on students' sense of belonging, on sort of their emotional and psychological motivations to be in higher education. And even if it's not move-in, if they're maybe going down the road to community college, they may still sort of feel that impact of being a first-generation college student. And so thinking about what are ways that we can prepare students for that in the high school context, and or provide supports for them and sort of peer connection for them in the higher education context. One of the ways this shows up for a lot of students is this concept called dual alienation. And dual alienation is a combination of two things that you may have heard of before, which are imposter syndrome as well as traitor syndrome. And so imposter syndrome is when somebody feels like they don't belong in a particular space. So for first generation college students, higher education as a system in the United States wasn't necessarily made with them in mind. And so they can come on a campus and feel like, I don't really belong in higher education for a multitude of reasons. And so therefore they feel like an imposter in that space. The other challenge, that's sort of the other side of this coin of dual alienation, is folks feeling like a traitor to their home community, to their family, those sorts of things. And so that can show up in all kinds of ways. So for myself, that sometimes shows up in people saying, oh, you don't talk like us no more. Your accent's not as thick as it used to be. Or why are you always so dressed up, right? Or this is sort of a Southern phrase, but you think you're too big for your britches now, and all of those sorts of pieces. And so you can feel like because you are pursuing this other avenue, and maybe you're not taking over the family business or working in a field that is more dominant in your county or something like that, that you feel like you are sort of being a traitor to your sort of background and identities. And so this combination of feeling like an imposter in the higher ed space and feeling like a traitor perhaps in your home space sort of makes students feel like there's not a complete sense of belonging for them anywhere. So they can maybe play in the higher ed space and feel okay there, and maybe go home and feel okay there, or still live at home and feel okay there. But you don't quite fit into either space completely. And so that's sort of this concept of dual alienation that a lot of first generation college students feel, although not all of them do. The other thing, and this is why I just mentioned that it might be something they feel, but it's not always something they feel, is that not the first gen college student experience is not the same for every single first generation college student. And so while sometimes in the literature or in our practice, we may treat it as this monolithic experience, it's not. It's a multitude of different things based on the combination of students' identities with their first generation college student status. So you'll see here, you may have a whole group of students in your high school or at your community college that are all first generation college students. But if you intersect that with their race, their ethnicity, their gender, their sexuality, their social class, their age, all of those things, their religion, it's going to be a different experience for them. And I'll give you sort of a personal example of that. So when I was an undergraduate student at LSU, a really good friend of mine, her name is Lakia Jones, was also a first-generation college student at LSU. And so people might say, well, you were first-gen students, you must have had some similarities. We absolutely did. And that is what our friendship was sort of born of, was some of those common experiences we had as first-generation college students from rural areas in Louisiana. But where things started to diverge were that I identify as white, Kia identify as Black. I identify as Catholic. He identified as Baptist. We were from different parts of the state. I was sort of from the south, the southern part of Louisiana, and she was more so from northern Louisiana. And then we were also studying different things in terms of how our gender dynamics showed up for us in academic spaces. So I was somebody who identified as a cisgender woman studying education, where there were a lot of other cisgender women, particularly cisgender white women, whereas Kia was studying agricultural economics. And so she identified as a Black cisgender woman who was studying economics, agricultural economics specifically. And so there were not a lot of other students of color in that space, nor were there not a lot of women. And so in terms of how gender showed up for us in our first gen experience and how race showed up, it showed up differently based on what we were studying, even though we were both first generation college students at the same four-year institution. And so as we think about serving first generation college students, we can't think that we're going to create this one program or this one thing and it's going to serve all first generation college students, because it really is about their first generation college student status plus their, what the literature calls their social identities, right? Their race, their social class, their age, their gender, their religion, and their sexuality. And then in addition to that, so this big seven, which Beverly Tatum coins, which are the ones I was just mentioning, race, social class, age, etc. There are other statuses and experiences that students bring that layer with their first generation college student status and experience. And so things like their family status and their caregiver status. So their relationship or lack thereof to their families, if they were students who were formerly in foster care, if they have children or are a caregiver for someone else in their family, that will create a very different first gen experience for them than somebody like me who was not responsible to or for giving care to other people while I was an undergraduate student. Their veteran status, so if they have served in the military, how does that sort of impact their first gen status, particularly as we think about things like mental health, around financial aid and the different types of financial aid that veteran students have. Geographic background, so urban, rural, suburban is going to also play in here. An urban first generation college student's experience might be very different than a rural first generation college student's experience. How they are studying in terms of enrollment status. Are they studying part-time, full-time? What might that look like? Are they studying in primarily online courses and programs or residential? And then one of my colleagues who is a psychologist often talks about also their traumatic experiences. And so there is research on adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, and how that also layers with first generation college student experiences. So whether that is like family and home dynamics that may have been traumatic for students, if they are students who have experienced sexual assault. And so thinking about all these different parts that students are bringing with them in terms of their identities and experiences really shifts how they experience being first generation college students. So again, it's not a monolithic experience, and we have to understand the nuances and layers to how students are experiencing being first gen. The data from the Center for First Gen Student Success points to this, and so this will show you that all the orange bars here, or yellowish orange, are related to first generation college students. So more first gen students attend part-time, more of them are caregivers, more of them are veterans, more of them are women, and more of them are students who identify as BIPOC, or Black, Indigenous people of color. And so knowing that, again, how those things layer is going to be important to how we serve and support first generation college students. We also know that more of first-generation college students are coming from poor and working class backgrounds. So it doesn't mean all first-generation college students are, but there is a greater likelihood, you can see here, with median parental income, as well as they are students who are generally older in terms of age. And so you can see here 28% of first-generation college students are 30 or above. And so again, thinking about those different layers and dynamics and what that looks like. Students speak to this. So here are some quotes from students talking about being caregivers. So Sophia from University of Texas at Arlington talks about taking care of her mom and her siblings and her nephews, and that even if the family may not be asking the student to do that, they still feel an obligation or responsibility. And in Sophia's case, in terms of finances, and other cases, it might be in terms of literal caregiving and being in a space, or babysitting, or providing medical care, or those sorts of things for family members. And Xavier, who's at Stanford, talks about sort of the opposite, that I mentioned earlier, dual alienation. Xavier here mentions duck and imposter syndrome, but that I expected to have it, but I didn't feel that way. I felt like I belonged. I felt like I was happy. And speaks to his experience with his mother, saying, "You grew your wings yourself. I'm not going to cut them." And so sometimes, while there may be some literature that speaks to this, or experiences that students say they don't have the support of their families, a lot of first-generation college students do have the support of their families, who are saying, "Yes, we understand, we support you, we want you to go and be successful in higher education." So there's not one sort of universal family experience. It varies based on each individual student in a lot of cases. And then as we think about graduate students, so Sam is at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and talked about also that the first-generation college student status wasn't over when they graduated from their undergraduate program, that similar sort of barriers and challenges were faced when they were pursuing a graduate degree as well. And so Sam talks about being keenly aware of their graduate student identity as a first-generation college student, and that sort of the hidden curriculum they had uncovered in undergrad had not transferred to that graduate experience. Conversely, Chris, who is at Stanford, specifically talked about being both Black and queer in addition to their first-generation college student identities, and not viewing those things necessarily as barriers, but things that are going to inform, in this case, how Chris wanted to be a lawyer and how they wanted to interact with people of different identities as well. So again, different students, different experiences, even though all of them identified as first-generation college students. So I guess the ultimate message of what I'm wanting us to think about here is that we can't make assumptions that if a student is first gen, they must also be this other identity or experience. So we can't assume that if a student is first gen, they're automatically poor working class. So we don't want to assume that a first-gen student is also a Pell recipient, or a first-gen student is also a work-study recipient. That may be true for some first-generation college students. It was absolutely true for me. I received the Pell Grant. I was a work-study. I worked on campus through a work-study job. I had, to seek every scholarship that existed in order to be able to access higher education, whereas a cousin of mine is also a first-generation college student, but their family had a very successful family business. And so the finance sort of money part wasn't present for them as a first-generation college student. And so me and my cousin would need very different probably support structures, even though we do have some commonality there, but understanding that one does not equal the other. The same is true that we don't want to assume that first-generation college students are always Black, Indigenous students of color. We see in the data that more first-gen students do identify as Black, Indigenous, Native, Latinx, et cetera, but there are quite a number also of white first-generation college students. So we can't make the assumption that one equals the other. We have to really dig into nuance and understanding and think about how we want to offer supports and where those supports are located. And so Dr. Sarah Whitley talks about this in the four-year landscape analysis from the Center for First-Gen Student Success, talking about often first-gen support programs are placed in areas where we do start to conflate some identity. So if we only put first-gen support programs in multicultural affairs offices, then are we serving white first-generation college students? Or if we put first-gen student support programs in financial aid, sort of attached to Pell Grant or work study, then how are we serving first-generation college students who are middle class or affluent students? And so really starting to think about some of those nuances and where we put things and how that may only serve a certain percentage of first-generation college students and not the broader swath of first-generation college students. So why should West Virginia sort of think about and care about first-generation college students. And I'm sure because you are doing the work in West Virginia, both in high schools, community colleges, and four-year universities, is you already know about these things, right? You already know there are broader sort of numbers of first-generation college students in the state of West Virginia. And there's also a push by the state and by the West Virginia Higher Ed Policy Commission to increase the number of folks in West Virginia who have some kind of credential. These numbers are really about sort of 2 and 4 year sort of formal degrees through community colleges and universities. But right now the state is at about 31.7% of people who have those sorts of credentials. And by 2030, through the sort of West Virginia's CLIMB initiative, want to see 60% of folks in the state of West Virginia have a 2-year or 4-year credential of some kind. And so thinking about the way sort of to increase those numbers is to sort of seek out and support first-generation college students pursuing higher education in the state of West Virginia. So if you're working at a high school as a college counselor or a teacher or a guidance counselor of some kind, how perhaps are we demystifying the process of which people can pursue post-secondary education, whether that is a technical school, a cosmetology school, community college for an associate's degree, a bachelor's degree at a 4-year institution, and sort of what does that look like? So that way we are contributing sort of to this effort of West Virginia's CLIMB, but also impacting individual first-generation college students, and then by sort of spread, also perhaps their families and communities in the state of West Virginia as well. And these numbers are sort of statewide numbers. You can also break down the numbers at individual county level data. And so it does range quite widely in West Virginia. So you have anywhere from a county that has 8% of its residents in the county who have a 2 or 4 year credential, anywhere to 48%. So there's about a 40% range or difference between the counties in West Virginia, settling in on that 31.7% average of folks who have that. So through your work in high schools, through your work with, if you work in admissions or academic advising, or you teach courses in higher in institutions of higher education, is how are we building in those support structures? Again, not in ways that think about first-generation college students as a monolithic population, but that serve the specific needs that those students have, particularly the students who are in your high school or at your specific 2 or 4 year institution where you are working. If you need some resources to do some further learning and thinking and action planning around how to see first-generation college students as sort of this intersectional population, I would recommend a couple of things. So I've been mentioning the Center for First-Generation Student Success. They have a program, a recognition program called the First Gen Forward Initiative. And so those are recognizing institutions who have made sort of gains and done good work around supporting first-generation college students. So those would be great institutions from which to benchmark. And sort of see what they're doing and see what is scalable from sort of their institution to your institutions or your high schools. If you're working with some graduate students, the First Gen Docs and sort of collective is doing great work. So Dr. Rachel Coakley, Lamisha Brown, and Jason Wallace started that initiative and are doing great work with first generation doctoral students. And then celebrating first gen students is also a great way, as well as celebrating faculty and staff. So I think helping students see that there are teachers and administrators and counselors and faculty members who also identify as first gen helps with those points of connection and sense of belonging. And so every year on November 8th is First Generation College Student Celebration Day. And so lots of campuses are starting to sort of celebrate the first generation college student experience. And in terms of further resources for learning, again, looking at intersections. So the Black First Gen Collective is run by our colleague, Dr. LaTanya, or LT Reese Miles, out in California. They're doing great work specifically on the Black First Gen experience. There's some great documentaries around the First Gen experience. One is called Unlikely and talks a lot about students who have stopped out or caregivers and are trying to come back into higher education through different sort of forms and fashions. So that is a great learning tool as well, again, to look at the nuance of these first generation college students' experiences. There's some great podcasts around this through NPR and some other spaces as well. And there definitely is literature you can read. The Journal for First Generation Student Success just launched. We submitted or released the first issue in April. And then there are a number of books here. Dr. Teresa Hines-Hussell has some great work, again, around intersecting identities. Myself and Dr. Becky Martinez wrote a book about straddling class in the academy that sort of looks at the intersection between social class and first-generation college student status. Some great work on geographies of campus inequality when thinking about first-generation college students, so urban, suburban, and rural. And then a brand new book by Dr. Robert and Hope Longwell-Grice, again, about the intersections of first-generation college student experiences. So all different resources that you can use to sort of plug in and think about the differentiation in first-gen experiences based on their identities and other sort of life statuses as well. And I think we are about at time. I want to be able to answer any questions that might have arisen in this conversation. I hope what you take from this is that we don't have a specific definition of first gen. It can vary both institutionally and nationally. And how do we think about first gen college students not as one sort of lump of a similar experience, but as sort of these different experiences that are threaded through the first gen college student experience, but that result in different ways students experiencing being first gen. And I think we can create some great support structures for students at the high school level, at the community college level, as well as at the university level. So I hope this has been thought-provoking for you, and I welcome any questions that are in the chat box.
Thank you, Dr. Ardwin. This is very thought-provoking. We've had some questions that have actually come in the chat box. The first one I think that I may be able to address, though, because it's specific to West Virginia. And so someone was asking if the Higher Education Agency, the Policy Commission, publishes first-generation numbers by college. We do not require institutions to report that up to the agency. However, institutions can collect that information on a case-by-case basis. In addition to that, the FAFSA does ask a question, and of course, this goes back to the definition being complicated, as Dr. Ardwin mentioned earlier when she's talking about defining the term. And that is that the FAFSA asks about educational status in terms of a bachelor's 4-year degree of the parents. So in that case, they could be collecting that data. And then a question came in about, as a first generation college grad, ×3, how much of your success was attributed to your internal drive? And how much can be attributed to someone in your life who pushed you to be the best? That's a great question.
It is a great question. And to go back to your first question, if you are on a campus, you can also call your institutional or email or contact your institutional research office. I know that I can sign in to my institutional research office as an employee and play with all the data. And so your campus may be collecting that data at the campus level, and your institutional research office would be a good contact to see if you are collecting that data and then how you might be able to access that data. In terms of my motivation, I would say it was a both and, but I really think it was cultivated primarily by my grandparents and my parents. So I lived next door to my maternal grandparents my whole life, and I heard from both them and my parents that you need to get an education to have a good life. And nobody defined what good life was for me, but there was sort of this underlying current that it wasn't what we had. And so from a very early age, my grandmother took me to the library every week in the summer, and she cultivated, she had a middle grades education and really cultivated my interest in books and reading and all of those things. I had amazing teachers and counselors and people sort of throughout my experience. There were also some negative experiences with some of those people as well, but I really focused on those positive experiences of people who were investing in me and who said, have you thought about, or did you consider, or here's a scholarship application. And so I really think it was a both and mix there, but I do believe sort of the support of my family and the support of folks I met through my educational journey were extremely helpful to me in that process, because there are people who ask me questions that, I can think of the woman who I interacted with at LSU, Dr. Casey White, who introduced me to the thought of going to graduate school to get a master's degree in higher ed and student affairs. And then as I was a master's student, Dr. Robert Schwartz was one of my faculty members, and he's like, hey, one day you're going to be go get a doctorate and be a faculty member. And I was like, you're bananas, Dr. Schwartz. Like, that's never going to happen. But there were these folks along the way who helped me see possibility in me that I would have never seen based on sort of the opportunity structures that had been available to me and to people in my community. So I think it's a both and, but all of you who are doing work as educators, I promise you, if you are having a positive impact on those students. And when you say to a student, have you ever thought about, and I try to do that a lot now for students, and saying, hey, when you're ready to go get a doc degree, I'm ready to write your letter of recommendation. And so helping people see possibilities that may not have been ones they sort of generated for themselves.
We've had a lot of great comments coming in. For example, Nick mentioned that much of what you had said is completely relatable to her as a first-gen college student and graduate, and never felt connected to the campus. And so programs like TRIO programs and Upward Bound, how they impact a student's life as they're going through navigating the college-going process. And so a lot of additional comments coming in, just really relating to some of the things that you have said today. And I know here in our state and our institutions, and also at the secondary level, there are a lot of those TRIO programs and Gear Up programs that help provide additional supports in addition to what our schools are already doing. A question I have for you, Dr. Ardwin, is specific to that transition process. So we're working with secondary schools and the counselors and the many hats that they wear, helping to prepare those students to hand them off to matriculate to the post-secondary journeys, wherever they're going to be, if it's a career and technical center, 2-year institution, or 4-year. And what recommendations would you have, or what have you seen that have been effective in terms of support systems during that transition process?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and I'm going to talk a little bit about this in my breakout session in the next slot, but is thinking about sharing of information in ways that are consumable. And so I think sometimes in higher education, we, from the institutional side, develop these resources that we think, oh, it's a great website, or oh, it's a great handout, or it's a great, but it may be filled with jargon and acronyms that are not consumable by folks who don't sort of swim in that language or in that world. And so I would say simplifying a lot of the language for folks. So again, we're creating sort of smoother pathways and making them feel like, oh, I understand this pamphlet, or I understand this website, or I understand my program of study that I'm going to, study in, or those sorts of things. So information, I think, is huge, and information sharing in ways that are sort of consumable. And then I think points of connection. And so I think, you mentioned Gear Up and TRIO and student support services once they get to the 4-year space. I think all those are phenomenal, and they're resource limited, right? So there's only so many grants you can get. There's only so many students you can serve. And so how are we helping other students make connections to folks that they feel like they have some commonality with, whether it's around race or rurality or sexuality or whatever it may be. A lot of my really good friends I made in college were other first-generation college students or other rural students, right? Or other women. And so how are we helping those students find those connection points? And so that may be through student organizations, that may be through faculty and staff on campus, but helping them find that point of connection so they don't feel like they're alone, and they don't feel like they're the only one having sort of that kind of experience, I think can be really helpful as well. And so I think those two things, like how do I have information, how do I navigate the system, and then also where are there people who I can sort of chat with about or ask questions to, and not feel like they're going to look at me like, why do you have that question? So I think the information and the connection would be two things that would help make those smoother transitions.
Fantastic points. And I know we do know that going back to building those one-on-one relationships with students and even their families when possible really speaks a lot to the ability to be able to support those students and help them through the process. Mm-hmm. We're getting close to our closing time here for this afternoon plenary. And Dr. Ardwin, we want to thank you for your time and the information that you've shared with our audience today. And thank everyone for joining us for this plenary session. Feel free to visit the exhibitors hall as you prepare for your next session that's scheduled to begin at 2:15. If you would like to hear more about Dr. Ardwin's work and research, she will be leading a session. And of course, we have a number of other great sessions lined up that you may select from. We'll see you in the next session here in just a little bit. Thanks, everyone.
Thank y'all.